Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Reality. Sometimes it's just stranger than fiction. And today's case is a prime example. We're going back to 2015 to a small town in South Australia called Wynarka. Imagine a desolate highway cutting through the outback and a lone suitcase just abandoned by the side of the road. And inside that suitcase, it wasn't clothes or valuables. It was the skeletal remains of a young child.
It's a discovery that just sends shivers down your spine, doesn't it? And what makes it even more eerie is that this wasn't just some isolated incident. This suitcase, with its heartbreaking contents, it would have eventually unlocked a complex double murder case that spanned years and hundreds of miles.
A story that takes us from that vast emptiness of the Australian outback to the dense forests of New South Wales, where another set of skeletal remains had been found 5 years earlier. And as investigators would soon discover, these two cases, seemingly worlds apart, they were intricately connected.
The remains found in the Belanglo State Forest back in 2010, they were a source of immense speculation. The location itself, notorious for the crimes of serial killer Ivan Milat, immediately fueled those suspicions, but forensic examination quickly ruled out Milat as the perpetrator. The timeline didn't match up, and these remains were left there long after he was already behind bars.
So the mystery deepened. Police nicknamed the unidentified woman Angel, based on a motif on a T-shirt found with the body. They even released a facial reconstruction image in 2011, hoping that somebody would come forward with information, but the leads just dried up and the case went cold.
Now fast forward to the discovery of the suitcase in Wynarka in 2015. A motorist passing through, he noticed it by the side of the highway. He stopped to take a look, and well, as you know, he found the remains of a small child along with some clothing and a rather unique handmade quilt.
And that quilt, it turned out, it was the key to unraveling this entire case. Police launched a public appeal. They were really focusing on this unique quilt. And after over 1,200 calls to Crime Stoppers, two critical tips came in. One caller recognized the quilt. They believed it was made by the child's grandmother.
And that second caller, they were actually able to confirm that suspicion. They had photographs of a child named Khandalyce Pearce, and in one of those pictures, Khandalyce was in a stroller with that same quilt. And another picture showed her wearing a pink dress that was also found in the suitcase.
DNA testing confirmed that those remains belonged to Khandalyce. But the real bombshell came when a national DNA database search linked Khandalyce to the unidentified woman from Belanglo State Forest. She was Khandalyce's mother, 20-year-old Karlie Pearce Stevenson.
Suddenly, these two seemingly unconnected cases, years apart, hundreds of miles away, they were intertwined. It was a major breakthrough for investigators. But it also marked the beginning of a very dark and disturbing journey as they began to piece together the events that led to these horrific murders.
And at the heart of this twisted tale was a man named Daniel Holdom, Karlie's boyfriend, at the time of her disappearance. It turned out Holdom had a history of violence against women. In fact, he was already serving time in prison for sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl when police identified him as a suspect in the murders of Karlie and Khandalyce.
What's really unsettling is that there were signs. Early warning signs that were missed. Holdom's phone records actually placed him near Belanglo State Forest around the time of Karlie's death. Witnesses had even reported seeing Holdom and Karlie arguing and leaving together in a car, leaving little Khandalyce behind. Holdom later returned to collect the child.
But those pieces of information wouldn't come together until much later. In the meantime, Holdom continued to weave his web of deceit, manipulating those around him and covering his tracks.
And as investigators dug deeper, a very chilling picture started to emerge. They found motel receipts, records of duct tape purchases, and they gathered witness statements. All of these pointed to Holdom being with Khandalyce in the days following Karlie's disappearance.
The evidence was mounting, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Holdom was responsible for not only Karlie's disappearance, but also the death of her innocent daughter.
Forensic evidence would later reveal the brutality of Karlie's murder. Holdom had stomped on her throat and chest, causing multiple fractures and ultimately suffocating her. While the exact cause of Khandalyce's death was harder to determine due to the state of decomposition, the evidence suggested that she had also been suffocated.
It's just a horrifying thought the way those poor victims met their end. The level of violence involved is unimaginable.
Dishcloths were found stuffed in Khandalyce's mouth, and her head had been covered with a diaper and secured with duct tape. Just the thought of the terror that poor child must have experienced is unbearable.
It's truly heartbreaking. But the depravity doesn't end there. Holdom. Not only did he commit these heinous acts, but he then went on to exploit Karlie's death for financial gain.
Absolutely. After killing Karlie, Holdom used her bank cards and her identity documents to steal over $70,000 from her accounts. He even contacted her family, pretending to be Karlie, to reassure them that she was alive and to solicit money.
He was profiting off of their grief. Despicable.
And he didn't do this alone. He had help from his ex-girlfriend, Hazel Passmore.
That's right. Passmore impersonated Karlie at a credit union and a Centrelink office to access her benefits. This went on for years.
And what exactly is Centrelink?
It's Australia's social security agency. Hazel was pretending to be Karlie to access her welfare benefits.
This Holdom, he sounds like a real monster. What was Hazel's role in all of this? Was she afraid of him? Or just as heartless?
That's a question that's haunted a lot of people who have followed this case. It's a complex situation with no easy answers.
Well, thankfully, Holdom's reign of terror finally ended in 2015 when he was arrested and charged with both murders. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him, it was just overwhelming. Motel records placed him in the same town. Duct tape purchases matched the type used to bind the child, and there were witness statements. There was also his own confession to Hazel. It was an airtight case.
So Holdom's fate was sealed. But what about Hazel? Did she face any consequences for her role in all of this?
That's where things get a little controversial. In exchange for her testimony against Holdom, Hazel was granted immunity. She revealed details about his confession, his financial exploitation of Karlie, and even the existence of a very disturbing notebook.
A notebook.
Yeah, this notebook, it contained a list of children's names with the words forced or consent written next to them. Khandalyce's name was on that list with the word forced. It paints a very disturbing picture of Holdom's depravity, and it raises questions about other potential victims out there.
That's just sickening. So Holdom went to trial and...
He changed his plea to guilty shortly before the trial was set to begin. He actually later tried to appeal that guilty plea, but was denied. In the end, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison.
A fitting end for someone who committed such horrendous acts. But what about the families of the victims? How do you ever find closure after something so horrific?
It's difficult to imagine the pain that they must have endured. Karlie's mother, Colleen, tragically passed away back in 2012. She died believing that her daughter and granddaughter were alive and well. Her last words were reportedly, "Are Karlie and Khandalyce here yet?"
That's just absolutely heartbreaking. And what about Karlie's other family members?
They expressed just a profound sense of loss and betrayal. To come to terms with the reality of the crimes, how their loved ones were taken from them, is just unimaginable. They were robbed not only of their loved ones, but also of the chance to say goodbye.
This case clearly had a huge impact on the Australian public, too.
Absolutely. The discovery of Khandalyce's remains in that suitcase, the connection to the unidentified woman in Belanglo, and just the sheer cruelty of the crimes, it all captivated the nation's attention and sparked widespread outrage and demand for justice. The case became a symbol of vulnerability, how easily someone can just disappear, and how crucial it is to never stop searching for answers.
It's a reminder that evil can really lurk in the most unexpected places, and that even those we think we know can be capable of unthinkable acts.
This case also raises questions about the role of law enforcement. Why wasn't that missing persons report for Karlie followed up on more thoroughly? Why was Holdom, a known offender with a history of violence against women, allowed to just roam free?
And then there's the question of Hazel's immunity deal. Was it truly justified? These are all questions that continue to be debated. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of this tragedy is the unwavering strength and resilience of those families who, despite unimaginable loss, continue to fight for justice and keep the memory of Karlie and Khandalyce alive.
Their story serves as such a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and love can persevere.
It's certainly a lot to take in. This case is incredibly complex and emotionally charged.
I understand. It's the kind of story that just stays with you.
It certainly does.
This case also raises important questions about domestic violence and how we can better protect those who are the most vulnerable.
And the importance of community vigilance. If that motorist hadn't stopped to investigate that suitcase, who knows how long it would have taken for Khandalyce to be found, or if she ever would have been.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's those seemingly insignificant actions that can make all the difference.
Well, we still have a lot to cover. We've gone over the victims, the investigation, the perpetrators, but there's still so much more to explore. We need to look closer at Holdom's past, his relationship with Hazel, and what led him to commit these acts. We also need to consider the role of the justice system and whether it truly served the victims in this case.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to learn from this tragedy and find ways to prevent something like this from ever happening again.
Exactly. So stay with us as we continue our examination of this truly harrowing case.
To really grasp, I think, the depth of this tragedy, we need to rewind a bit. Go back to 2008. A few months before Karlie and Khandalyce vanished, it all started with a devastating car crash, one that would have this ripple effect on everyone involved.
This crash was a pretty pivotal moment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The one that left Hazel Passmore Holdom's girlfriend at the time in a wheelchair.
Hmm.
And it tragically took the lives of 2 of her children.
It was horrific. It happened on September 15th, 2008. They were driving back to Alice Springs from Adelaide. A 16-hour drive. Daniel Holdom was behind the wheel. Hazel was in the passenger seat, and her 3 children were in the back. Fatigue set in, and Hazel pleaded with Daniel to pull over and rest.
But he didn't.
No, he didn't. And as they continued driving, 2 kangaroos jumped out in front of the car. Daniel swerved, lost control. The car flipped multiple times, landed on its side.
Every parent's worst nightmare.
2 of Hazel's children, 9-year-old Willow and 6-year-old Ryan. They were ejected from the vehicle and died at the scene. It's just unimaginable. Her youngest daughter survived. But Hazel sustained severe injuries, including a broken leg that ultimately had to be amputated.
This was just weeks before Karlie and Khandalyce vanished.
The timing is crucial here. While Hazel was in the hospital recovering from her injuries, grieving the loss of her children, Daniel Holdom began his relationship with Karlie Pearce Stevenson.
It's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah.
His girlfriend is hospitalized after this horrific crash that killed 2 of her children, and he starts seeing another woman. It's just a profound lack of empathy, wouldn't you say?
It does raise questions about his character and his capacity for compassion. What's even more disturbing is that he was later found to have taken photos of the crash scene, including images of his dead and injured stepchildren.
Why would anyone do that? Take pictures like that?
It's unclear. Some have speculated that he might have wanted to document the scene for insurance purposes. Others believe it was something much more sinister, a morbid fascination with death and suffering.
Either way, it's a disturbing detail. It just adds to this already complicated picture of this case.
Mm-hmm.
So with Hazel in the hospital and Daniel involved with Karlie, when exactly did Karlie and Khandalyce disappear?
It was in November 2008, shortly after the funeral for Hazel's children, Karlie, Daniel, and Khandalyce. They left Alice Springs together. Karlie's family actually urged her not to take Khandalyce, but she insisted on bringing her daughter.
It must have been a tough decision for her family, knowing the dangers that she might be facing.
They ended up in Canberra, staying at a friend's house, and that's where Karlie's trail runs cold.
But not right away, though, right?
Right. They stayed in Canberra for a few weeks, and according to witnesses, there was a lot of arguing between Karlie and Daniel. Karlie even called her family back in Alice Springs, expressing regret for leaving and saying that she wanted to come home.
But she didn't. Why not? Do we know if Daniel was preventing her from leaving?
It's a question that lingers. We know that he was abusive, and Karlie was in a vulnerable position far away from her family and her support system.
And then came the night of December 14th, 2008. Another argument erupted, and Karlie and Daniel left the house, leaving Khandalyce behind.
It was around 2:30 in the morning when they drove off. Daniel returned later alone, claiming that Karlie was fed up and wanted to go home. He said he'd drop her off at a bus station.
But she never made it home.
No. And then Daniel told Karlie's friends that she wanted him to take Khandalyce to her grandparents in South Australia.
But she never made it there either.
Correct. That was the last anyone saw of either of them. Daniel returned to Alice Springs a few days later and went straight to Hazel, begging her to take him back.
And incredibly, she did.
She did. Despite everything that had happened, despite her own grief and loss, she allowed Daniel back into her life.
It's a complex situation, isn't it? Trying to understand Hazel's motivations, what she knew and when. It's a puzzle with missing pieces. Trauma and grief can have such a powerful impact on a person's judgment.
Absolutely. We have to be cautious about, making assumptions or passing judgment without understanding the full context of her situation. So we have Karlie and Khandalyce missing, and Daniel's back with Hazel. What happens next? Does anyone report them missing?
It's a shocking fact that it took 9 months for a missing persons report to be filed.
Yeah.
It was Karlie's mother, Colleen, who finally contacted the police in September of 2009.
9 months. That's a long time. It makes you wonder about the communication within the family and what might have caused that delay.
It raises a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we may never have all the answers. But the police did eventually interview Daniel.
They did, and he claimed that he hadn't seen Karlie since February of 2009.
But we know that's a lie.
Of course. And there was other evidence that should have raised red flags for the police. They noticed activity on Karlie's bank cards, but they misinterpreted it as proof that she was still alive.
But it wasn't Karlie using those cards.
No, it was Daniel. He had taken her cards and was using them to steal her money. And just a few days after the police questioned him, Karlie's family received a text message supposedly from her saying that she and Khandalyce were fine and didn't want to be found.
So even then, Daniel was already creating a false trail, covering his tracks, and manipulating everyone around him.
He was a master manipulator. He was playing a very dangerous game, and tragically, it worked. The police closed the missing persons case based on that text message and the credit card activity.
It's difficult to believe that the police accepted his word so easily, especially given his history of violence.
It does highlight the need for really thorough investigations and the importance of recognizing the signs of manipulation. Sadly, in this case, crucial clues were missed, and as a result, Karlie and Khandalyce remained missing for years.
All that time, Daniel and Hazel were carrying on with their lives, spending Karlie's money, and pretending that she was still alive.
That's right. They continued this charade for years, even going so far as to have Hazel impersonate Karlie at various institutions to access her benefits. It's a testament to just their cold-heartedness.
So for 5 years, Karlie and Khandalyce were essentially forgotten. Then in 2010, hikers discover Karlie's remains in Belanglo State Forest. But at that point, no one connects those remains to the missing mother from Alice Springs.
The missing persons case had been closed, so she was no longer considered a missing person. The police had no reason to believe that the unidentified woman found in the forest, nicknamed Angel, could be Karlie. Even the facial reconstruction that they created didn't trigger any recognition.
It's a tragic irony. The answers were right there, but the pieces of the puzzle just weren't in place yet.
It's a stark reminder that sometimes even with the best intentions, justice can be delayed. In this case, it was the discovery of Khandalyce's remains. 5 years later, and hundreds of miles away. That finally brought everything to light.
That suitcase left on the side of the road was a turning point.
It was, and it was the public's response to the police appeal. Those phone calls to Crime Stoppers that ultimately led to the identification of Khandalyce, and that identification in turn led them to Karlie.
It's amazing how those small acts, those calls from people who just recognized a blanket and address, could have such a huge impact on the case.
They were absolutely crucial. They brought justice for Karlie and Khandalyce and exposed Daniel Holdom for the monster he truly is. But the story doesn't end there, does it? There's still the question of Hazel Passmore, her involvement in the fraud, and the very controversial immunity deal that she was given.
Hazel's role in all of this is complicated, to say the least. It's hard to know for sure whether she was a willing participant in Daniel's schemes or if she was coerced and manipulated. Did she know about the murders, or was she kept in the dark?
These are questions that have been debated extensively, and we may never have definitive answers, but we do know that Hazel played a crucial role in securing Holdom's conviction. Her testimony, while controversial, was undoubtedly damning.
She revealed a lot of information, didn't she?
She did. She spoke about Holdom's confession, his financial exploitation of Karlie, and his disturbing notebook filled with the children's names. It all contributed to painting a picture of his depravity and helped to ensure that he would never be free to harm anyone again.
So in the end, Hazel walked free while Holdom was left to face the consequences of his actions in prison. Is that justice?
That's a complex question with no easy answer. But we can say with certainty that Holdom is where he belongs, behind bars, unable to inflict his cruelty on anyone else. And while Hazel may have escaped legal punishment, she will forever bear the weight of her involvement in this tragedy.
And what about the families of the victims? How do they find peace after something so horrific?
For them, there's no true closure. The pain of losing Karlie and Khandalyce in such a brutal way will forever be with them. But perhaps there's some solace in knowing that their loved ones' stories have been told, that their memories are kept alive, and that justice, though imperfect, was served.
It's a case filled with sadness and loss, but it also highlights the resilience of the human spirit and the power of hope even in the face of unimaginable darkness.
The murders of Karlie Pearce Stevenson and Khandalyce Pearce shocked Australia to its core, forcing us to confront the reality of violence against women and children, the vulnerabilities of those living on the margins of society, and the flaws in our systems that sometimes fail to protect those who need it most.
It's a story that begs us to remember to learn and to strive for a better future, where tragedies like this are no longer possible.
It also prompts us to think about the intricacies of human relationships, the choices people make under duress, and the difficulties in balancing accountability with compassion.
We've examined the evidence, explored the motivations, and grappled with the ethical dilemmas. But ultimately, it is the enduring memory of Karlie and Khandalyce that remains. Their lives cut short so tragically remind us of the preciousness of life and the urgent need to protect the most vulnerable in our society.
Their story is a call to action, a plea for awareness, and a testament to the strength of the human spirit when faced with unimaginable loss.
And with that, we conclude our exploration of this truly heartbreaking case.
Before we wrap things up, I think there are a couple more things we should touch on.
Okay, what else is there to consider?
Well, there's that notebook.
The one with the list of children's names. What more can you tell us about it?
It was unsettling to say the least. Khandalyce's name was on it right next to the word forced. But there were other children too, some with ages even listed next to them and the words forced or consent written next to them.
Are we talking about a hit list here? Could there be more victims out there that we don't know about?
It's a truly horrifying thought, but one that investigators had to confront. They really scrutinized the notebook, trying to identify all of those children and find out if any of them were missing or had been harmed.
What happened? Did they connect Holdom to any other crimes against children?
That part of the investigation has remained under wraps. The authorities haven't released any information about whether they were able to link Holdom to any other crimes.
So we're left with this cloud of uncertainty hanging over everything. It's like this notebook is some kind of Pandora's box that we may never fully be able to understand.
It definitely adds another layer of darkness to this already tragic story.
And then there's the lawsuit that Hazel filed against Daniel after the car crash.
Oh, right. In 2011, Hazel actually sued Daniel for the injuries she suffered in that crash. She argued that her employment prospects were severely limited because of the amputation and her other injuries.
Wait, so she sued the man who was driving the car when her children were killed?
It does seem strange, doesn't it? But you have to remember that any settlement wouldn't have come out of Daniel's pocket.
Yeah.
It would have been covered by insurance.
So basically they saw a way to profit from this horrific accident.
Yeah.
It's just awful.
It does raise some pretty serious ethical questions, too. Was the crash a genuine accident, or was it somehow staged for financial gain? We know Daniel was a reckless driver, and they were having money problems at the time.
And Hazel was willing to use the deaths of her own children for money.
It's impossible to know for sure what was going through her mind or what kind of pressure she may have been under. The court records are actually sealed, so the details of the settlement are unknown.
So many unanswered questions. This case seems to just generate more questions than answers.
That's often the case with crime, unfortunately. We piece together the fragments of information that we have, but we may never have the full picture, and sometimes the truth is just too difficult to even comprehend.
I suppose you're right. But even with all the darkness surrounding this case, were there any signs of hope in this story?
There were. The dedication of the investigators, the tireless efforts of those who never stopped searching for Karlie and Khandalyce, the public's response to all of the appeals, and the eventual arrest of a very dangerous criminal. All of these things point to the good that can exist even when confronted with such evil.
And the strength of the victims' families facing years of not knowing, only to be met with such a horrific truth, and yet they never gave up hope. They fought tirelessly for justice.
Their resilience is inspiring. They chose to honor the memory of Karlie and Khandalyce in a positive way, channeling their grief into a force for good. They've become advocates for awareness and prevention, making sure that their loved ones are never forgotten.
That's a powerful message to end on. I really hope their story inspires others to never give up the fight for justice and to always keep seeking the truth.
I think that's the most important thing we can take away from this, the importance of remembering, learning, and working towards a world where tragedies like this no longer happen.
Tune in tomorrow to hear Simon and Tom's review of this case and all the other cases this week. Meanwhile, we'll be back on Monday with another fascinating true crime episode.
Have a great weekend.